Okay. Yeah, so tonight we're doing a 2D art workshop for game assets and also a little brief thing on asset implementation. Um, and yeah, just for a bit of overview, we're going to go over some jobs that are available to 2D artists in the industry, recommended software, asset production, and lastly, and kind of a major part of this workshop that I wanted to include, is a not brief, but surface level overview of some animation techniques and tips. Because if there's one thing that I've learned over the years, it's that animation is hard, and people should be ready to experience that. But yeah, this workshop should be beneficial for both programmers and artists. Some artists more so than programmers, obviously, but we'll get there. So yeah, let's hop into it. So what jobs are available for 2D artists in the games industry? Well, there's the general 2D artist and animator, which is kind of just like, hey, I'm the person that makes characters and backgrounds. It's like you're working on a 2D project. You're one of the 2D artists. Pretty self-explanatory. Requires skills in animation and generally high skills in drawing, design, all that good stuff. Then we've got UI artists, which is applicable to any type of project, so a little bit less restrictive. You'll see these types of positions pop up pretty regularly for new projects and whatnot. The difference being between this and other art positions that you are a lot more focused on themes like human-centered design, user experience, things like that are a little bit more design oriented rather than artistically oriented, I suppose, to kind of demonstrate the line that exists between those two things. Then you've got concept artist. This is definitely the most artistically demanding in terms of general skill sets, because you need to be able to design characters and environments and iterate on them, respond to feedback, comply with stylization guidelines, stuff like that. But this is also a very common position that you'll see on any sort of project, 2D or 3D. And finally, texture artist. This is a type of skill set that is only applicable to 3D in a lot of cases, but still requires a high level of skill and knowledge in 2D art. So it's kind of a funny one where I was like, is this even a 2D art job? I guess so. But it is only generally applicable for 3D. As for some software, you've got your classics, Photoshop with GIMP as a free alternative. Raster graphics software, kind of a Swiss Army knife, very solid general purpose. Photoshop is a $20 a month subscription because Adobe is silly like that. But GIMP is free, and also you can get it through fun secret methods that I will not disclose here. But gosh, it sure would be crazy if someone looked up how to pirate Adobe software.
I think you're able to do it legitimately through the library also.
Huh?
I don't even have I don't pay for Adobe, but I just have an account, and if you go to the library, those computers
they have it set up on there?
Yeah, so if you'd have to work on one of the library computers, which I think it's just some of them though.
That's good to know. Yeah.
But yeah, the whole Adobe suite is on it.
Yeah. I will say also some of the Adobe products are available to students for free. Like I have a Substance Painter subscription that I'm not paying for, that I have for 3 years as a student. Photoshop is not one of those because they're lame like that. But yeah, next up we got the VGDC endorsed classic A-Sprite, which is a single payment of $20 on Steam or Itch, and is the best software ever made, with no bias. It's actually very, very similar to Photoshop in a lot of ways. It's just a lot of the tools that are available to you through this software are more catered to a lower fidelity, pixel art environment. LibreSprite is the free alternative that I would recommend for A-Sprite. It is literally just A-Sprite, but they forked an earlier version, made it available a lot more easily. You can also actually compile A-Sprite if you know how to do that. And then we've got Procreate and Krita, which compared to Photoshop are a lot more, Photoshop is a photo doctoring software, but also it can do 2D art. Procreate and Krita are far more specifically designed to be a digital art, like painters, animators software. Photoshop you actually can animate in using layers in a weird way, but these have an actual animation timeline and tools that you can use for that sort of a thing. So they're pretty good for that. Krita is completely free and open source. Procreate is, $13, but it's limited to iPads. A lot of people like it though. There's also tons and tons of alternatives. You've got Pistol, which is a browser-based pixel art software, similar to Aseprite in a lot of ways. Just kind of, it's free, so it's not quite as frequently updated and adding the same level of niche tools and stuff like that. You've got Adobe Illustrator for vector art, which is something that I've never really considered using in games, but certainly is a useful software to know in general. Pixel Studio, which is another pixel art software available for mobile and also on Steam, I think. Blender, which actually has 2D art applications and is pretty good, from what I understand, for creating skeletal 2D animations where you take a sprite. I'll get into it later, but you take a sprite, you rig it. Very similar to how you would go about 3D, just a little less involved. And you can even use MS Paint. They're updating it for some reason, and it looks kind of good now. So it's an option. Yeah, what's up?
You can get the older version on it somewhere online. You can get the old build.
That makes sense. Yeah. So if you want to use the old awesome build,
it's better
compared to the new cringe and
it's
I don't know, it has layers now. What's up with that? But
Classic.
Mhm. Okay. Next up, we're going to cover asset integration a little bit. So, when making 2D assets and not using puppet animation or skeletal animation for game sprites, you're going to be doing sprite sheets, which is where you basically pack all of the frames of all of your animations for a game object or character or whatever into a single image. Some of the conventions are that you can pack them vertically per frame and horizontally per animation. So you see kind of here with that top image that I've included that you can just commonly find more professional sprite sheets laid out like that to be very digestible. You might notice at the top, at the very top, that is a completely not packed sprite sheet that has 140 some odd frames in it. So if you don't pack them like that, you can get some kind of funny images out of it. It's probably, I would guess, 100 by 10,000 pixels or something like that, which is kind of funny. But yeah, file formats, you gotta use the right types. Typically for animations like game characters and whatnot, you're gonna wanna use PNGs because they support transparency. Also there's SVGs for vector graphics. And then import settings, which I will, once I'm done with this section, go into Godot for a little bit and show off some of what options are available for importing your assets in there and whatnot. So in game engines, your assets are going to be automatically filtered. And so what that means is, especially if you're making pixel art, there will be an automatic anti-aliasing filter applied to them, and it'll make them look blurry and messy, especially if they've been upscaled. And you don't want that, so I will, at least for Godot, go into how to fix those issues, because you will definitely run into it if you're using Godot for your first gen. Then, yeah, so you gotta have an asset folder. That's you probably know that, but have to mention it when it comes to project structure. And the other thing, when it comes to updating sprite sheets, because you will probably find yourself in a position where you're exporting a sprite sheet and then you come back to it later to finalize assets or add additional things that you've thought of since you first exported it. Make sure that you add them to the end of the spreadsheet, so that when you are putting it back into your project, it doesn't overwrite existing animations, and your programmer doesn't have to go back in and redo all that stuff. So just save some time, especially depending on how much you're adding. Okay, so that's the end of that section. So we're going to go ahead and go into, let's see, where's Carson? Carson, you want me to just switch the window, or did you want to do the thing that you were saying?
Add plus.
Huh.
Display caption. Just, okay.
Okay.
Okay. Move it beneath video capture. Delete Godot.
What?
Delete Godot capture. Because of course now it's working.
Oh wait,
You're good.
it's working?
Just hide it. Just hide it.
Okay,
Okay, go again.
cool. So, cool, it worked. Okay, so yeah, here we've got a Godot 4 project. It's pretty bare bones. It has a tile set in it and a little, nope, not that one. This, what? Give me that. What the hell? Give me the other what are we doing? Please. Oh, why is it doing that? Get in there. Yeah, this guy. So yeah, you'll see kind of what I was talking about. This is super blurry. Not a great way to present your art. You, especially for pixel art, want some crisp art. So in Godot 4, the way that you're going to go about changing that is, why am I not seeing the top bar? There we go. So you're going to go into your project settings. You're going to go into rendering, textures, canvas textures, and you're going to change the default texture filter to nearest for pixel art. Of course, these all have their own use case. If you're finding issues with your assets and they're not pixel art, I would look into them individually. But yeah, once we change that and drag that PNG back in there, you'll notice it no longer has that filtering, looks very crisp. And there is another way to do this that you should avoid, which is you go into the individual node and change the filter there to nearest. Changing it into project settings is going to save you a lot of time, so just be aware of that. Also, while I've got it pulled up, in a lot of 2D games, you're going to be working with tiles, which means you're going to be making tile sets as assets, and they're going to look like messes, but they follow a certain convention. So essentially, the way that a tile set works is, did I delete it? Oh well. But, so this one is a grid of 16 by 16 tiles, where each one represents an individual tile. And Godot, in particular, has a tile map, which we can add here. Go in, we're going to make a new tile set. We're going to go to tile set and drag our file in there. So this allows us, and the parameters that you configure that for are all down here, to then go ahead and let's see, select you. Oh, don't give me trouble right now, man. Yeah, so basically you just select a tile, paint them in there. But that actually ends up being very time consuming. So this is set up, this file in particular is set up to be an auto tile. And the way that we set that up is, let's see, how do we set that up? We're going to go ahead and train sets, add element, match corner and sides for this particular one, but the other one is also useful. Then we're going to add, that's just going to change the color for us when we get into it. Yeah, we're going to go ahead and I believe go into here. Nope. How do I do this? Trains. Okay. I'm not going to lie, I looked this up like right before because they changed it. But anyways, essentially, you're going to be painting in for each tile the connection points. So for instance, this one down here, this is our default tile. Why? Come back. This is our default tile, right? So it doesn't have any connection points. It exists on its own as a single tile. So your connection point is only going to be itself, which will be represented in a 3x3 grid. You select the center point. Whereas this one has a connection point with a tile above it and a tile below it. So you're going to use the center because they're all connected to themselves, as well as a grid up here and a little grid piece down here. If I could remember off the top of my head how to set that up, I would show it in more detail, but I don't. So essentially, you can look up file templates for auto tiles and set them up accordingly. It'll show you through the template the connection points and allow you to set up a tile set that you just kind of paint it like this, and it displays the according tiles correctly. So as an artist, when making tile-based games, this is very important to know. It'll save you a lot of time in the long run, although they are a massive pain in the ass to create. All right, back to it. Maybe need to do anything with that. Okay, so now we're going to talk about a lot of animation stuff because it's difficult and important. So, in any software that supports animations and animation toolkits, you'll see the timeline as like the window or bar or whatever that you will be engaging with the most by far. The timeline, in some cases, you can enable thumbnails, which I wouldn't recommend because it makes it kind of cluttered, but it's there. You can add, over here, we've got tags, right? That helps you distinguish individual animations within your file. And yeah, you can see your frame count, etc. It's there. It's pretty self-explanatory, but you gotta know it. Then we've got layers and groups. So layers are basically just separate sheets that you put on top of one another, and the layer that is topmost displays in front of everything else. This is super important for non-destructive editing, which is insanely relevant to animation. Typically what I do, which you can kind of see in this image here, where I've got my layer and group organization set up, is I've got a layer for fully rendered sprites, which I just collapse all the layers into one and move that to a separate layer to just kind of exist on its own, ready for export. But when I'm actually animating, I separate all of the individual elements of a sprite that I'm working on. So in this case, we've got a cape, a plume, a head, body, arms, legs. Those are all animated separately from each other. And because of layers, it allows me to not have to draw an entire individual frame. I can focus on a single part, get that movement right, and move on to another one. So I would highly recommend kind of figuring out a workflow that incorporates that so that you're not redoing the same things over and over again. It saves a lot of time. You've got keyframes and tweening. So a keyframe is a frame that shows the most important elements of the motion of your animation. So essentially, if you look at this little guy up here, you can see what it's trying to communicate, right? It's a hit animation. He moves in for an attack and then resets. The one with the tweening, which is frames that exist in between your keyframes to actually show motion, is a lot more fluid and consistent with the motion. So they communicate the same ideas, but one is just much more smooth, and that's because the frame count has been bumped up, the motion in between each of the keyframes has been established, and it looks good. That's not my water. So another tool for onion skins pog. Another tool for animators is onion skins. Very, very, very helpful for tweening. Saves a lot of time there. Basically allows you to see the frame or frames if you want more than one for some reason in front of and behind the current frame that you're working on. So here it's the same frame. You've just got one where I've got the rendered sprite and one without it. So looking at the one that does not have a rendered sprite, maybe, like say I'm animating the cape back there, right? I've got this line that shows me where the cape is, I think, after that frame. and this one that shows me where it is before. So placing it here is the conscious decision without having to go back and forth between each frame to show that a lot of motion is happening in this frame. We're moving from here all the way to here, and then the frame after that, we're kind of sticking around there. So onion skins and tweening help you make a lot of rapid and informed decisions about the speed, weight, and amount of motion that you want to put into an animation. So they're pretty epic. All right, so this is what I was talking about earlier with what Blender can be kind of good for, is skeletal animation. And essentially, it is a 2D animation technique that splits your sprites into a bunch of different pieces. Whether that's like limbs and forelimbs, torsos. In this case, you've got like the jaw and the head separately so that they can animate the mouth, etc. And essentially, you just put these together, usually in Engine. It's highly recommended, actually, that you do this in Engine rather than in a software like Blender. Blender just has that capacity to animate stuff like this. And you just create animations through different transformations, moving the position, scaling, rotation, rotation relative to joints specifically, stuff like that. All right, and then I think when going into making game assets, especially if you already have an artistic background, is a little bit of an adjustment to figuring out, all right, what do I need to do that's hand-drawn and what would be best done in Engine? General rule of thumb, anything that is something that you want to make more dynamic, you do that in Engine, because otherwise you're just kind of brute forcing it. So up here I've got listed some examples that I've run into in the past of moments where I've had to get a little bit creative with how I'm actually producing my assets, and I'll also display an example that I set up a little bit to kind of show you what thinking about game assets is going to look like. So if I go over into a sprite, this one. All right. So in this example, let's say you want a player 1 and a player 2, and these sprites have the same silhouette, the same colors relative to hue, and the same, that basically. Rather than exporting two separate sprites that have the exact same animations, the exact same silhouette, etc., just merge them into one. Make a grayscale version. Then, in this example, the colors I'm using have a bit of hue shifting. So, meaning that like I've got this blue color here, that's very blue. Moving into this darker color, it's a bit more purple. Just shifting the hue as I go along. So what we can do about that is we add a tiny amount of hue to our colors. And you'll notice that if I go into this and I turn on color, it's the same color. This is a multiply layer. If I were to hide this layer, you'd see that's all it is. But we take the brightest hue, we multiply that on top of this, we've got the same colors. And the same thing can be applied to this one. So that is a much more efficient use of your time than animating and exporting and palette swapping these things just via an animation editor. Now, beyond that, I'll hide that for a moment. Let's say we want hats in our game. We want our little character to have hats, right? So, in line with what we were just saying, do not make an animation for every type of hat. Export them separately. Overlay them on top of your sprite in a smart way. And what you'll probably want to export is just this. You'll notice I added the shadow there because that doesn't actually exist in the base sprite. Layers, where are we? Yeah, so that is a part of a separate sprite, even though it's affecting the guy itself. And then finally, also, this still exists in, that part doesn't, but because I didn't think of that until just now. But for the most part, it still functions with the colors. You would just need to apply the same color multiply thing to that sprite. I just forgot about that. And finally, let's say that you want your guy to have a little idle animation where he's bouncing his head. And, where is it? Yeah. So, here's what it looks like by default. We want colors, we want hats. Colors, hats. The hat is a separate animation. You could move it with the position in-game, but given that it's pixels, I wouldn't do that. It's just going to look weird. So that's kind of an example of how you need to be thinking about assets when it comes to game production, because you don't want to waste a lot of time. You don't want to brute force everything. So you kind of have to be thinking about your asset production in relation to what you can do with a game engine, which means that you need to be approaching these things, or at least you want to try to learn to be approaching these things with an understanding of what can be accomplished in game engines in mind. Okay, back to it. So, another important thing to learn in relation to animating in games are the principles of animation. These will help you learn to convey motion in a expressive and either realistic or stylized fashion. It helps you make informed decisions about the animations that you're making. I'm not going to go over all of these because honestly there doesn't need to be 12. Some of them are kind of like, oh, you need a pencil to write, it turns out. So the ones I am going to go over, though, are the ones that I've found by far the most helpful. So first of all is squash and stretch. This one is probably the most versatile in my opinion in terms of the amount of things it can accomplish. Whether that's making something more cutesy or more expressive or conveying really exaggerated motion like we've got with Luffy down here. And the most important thing to learn about this, because you can look at any examples that you'll find on the internet and see that, yeah, obviously, as this ball bounces and hits the ground, it's going to compress a little bit. But what you need to know when it comes to actually animating things is the element of conservation of mass, which is very important, especially if you've got a complicated animation going on in managing the readability of a sprite, in managing the expectation of the motion that you're going for, in terms of like, does it fit in with the rest of my style? Is it too realistic? Is it too stylized? Stuff like that. So conservation of mass is the most important aspect of this, in my opinion. Next up, we've got anticipation, which is an interesting one from a game art perspective because of how it kind of plays with game design. So essentially, anticipation is just what it sounds like, basically. It's pretty self-explanatory. If you're going to perform an action, you're going to have some level of action that prepares you for it. So in these examples, for instance, you don't just go from frame 1 to we running now. You have to actually prep for it, which in this case is doing like a and then getting out there. Other example I've got here is someone throwing the ball. You don't just go from idling to balls out now. You have to actually do it, with this being the anticipation. And, oh yeah, so as far as it pertains to video games, from a design perspective, oftentimes, especially in more like action-oriented games, the anticipation that a player expects is them hitting the button. And you're not going to start animating a thing before the player hits the button. So a lot of times, when it comes to player characters in video games, people will opt to leave out anticipation in order to make it more fun to control. So how you manage your anticipation frames, whether it's a player or an enemy. Enemies having anticipation is often very good because that's actually, what's the word? Telegraphing an attack or something like that. So being aware of this principle in relation to the context of game design is one of those things that can make a design just much better. On the other end of things is your follow-through. So it's basically just the opposite of anticipation. An action that stops is going to have a certain amount of impact or secondary motion that needs to be conveyed. So in the examples here, we've got this woman landing from flying, and like thinking about the weight or the potential impact that goes into that landing. The animator has had her kind of go into and like absorb the impact of it. On the other hand, sudden stopping of walking, which might be a more relevant example to a lot of like side scroller games. Having a like, you know, his coattails kind of get out in front of him before going back into resting. An example of this that you might actually see in a game would be if you've ever played some of the old Sonic games, when you're going at a certain speed and then you turn around and start moving the other way, Sonic kind of skids to a stop and then starts running. So yeah. Next up, we got slow in and slow out. So this is kind of referring to, in the context of motion with gravity or some sort of resistance applied to it, you're not going to get a linear arc out of it. You're going to get an actual curve to your animations. So, for instance, if I take this bottle and then I throw it, it hovers in the air for a little bit. So, in animation, what that looks like is frame 1, frame 2, frame 3, frame 4, frame 5, frame 6, frame 7. It has an actual arc to it. And you can kind of see that laid out for you here on this one, where you've got this person jumping, following a smooth arc rather than just like a diagonal, like upside down V sort of a thing. So this one's also relevant to a bit more to programmers in some cases, because especially with jump animations, the motion being applied there is coming from the programming side of things, not the animators. So keeping things like this in mind can also be very good for making a game feel good in instances like that. Next up, we've got arcs. So this is more of a conceptual one, like actually thinking and planning out an animation. And what it refers to is really just the path of motion that your animation is going to follow. So as you can see at the bottom example here, we've got wind up for a punch, and then the arc to following through to our probably just final keyframe of the animation. It follows this arc. So planning your animation around that arc and that anticipated motion can be very helpful. They're also very good to understand when it comes to making looping animations, in the sense that good arcs make an animation that's repeating, as many times as it needs to, a lot less actually repetitive looking. And what I've found through years of making idle animations is that circular motions in your arcs are best at actually accomplishing that. So in this animation up here, you can see the hands doing kind of like this motion. It's not realistic, but it conveys a much better sense of motion than if it was simply just up and down rather than having that circular like looping back. And same with the ponytail up here, how it goes and does that circular motion. So just from personal experience, I've found that that can make much more interesting looking motion and much more interesting looking animation. And then we've got secondary animation, or action. So this is action that occurs in response to the primary action that the animation is conveying. This is examples kind of funny because it's not how you would typically think about secondary animation as your action as you're getting into animation, in the sense that like he's lifting a weight, but the secondary action isn't like, oh, I have to shift my legs to brace the weight of the weight. It's his face, which is like more of a, you can use it to establish characterization. Another example of secondary action in this context, in games, for instance, might be a way to establish character through an idle or a walk cycle. So like, for instance, if you have a character who's a professor or something like that, wearing a lab coat, maybe he's walking around kind of head down, kind of shuffling along, and his glasses start slipping down his nose, so he's got to push them back up. That's a secondary action that occurs in response to him walking that is not necessarily as explicit of a reaction as the example up here is, where the secondary actions are the plume in response to the kind of brisk walking pace, and the cape responding to the motion of rotating your body. So, understanding the kind of distinction and how they can be used to make animations more fluid and more just kind of, I don't know, having the quality of character, I guess, is very helpful as well. So yeah, that is it as far as my little lecture goes. But I was going to go ahead and take the remainder of our time to do a live demonstration of an animation, kind of show you how I think about, well, for one thing, going through an animation process, and for another thing, utilizing some of those principles. And if you'd like to follow along or do your own thing or have any questions, first of all, feel free to ask. Second of all, feel free to follow along or just kind of experiment around on your own if you would like. And yeah, there's a couple of other officers in here who also have some art knowledge, Chloe, Carson, Laney. So if you have any questions and I'm distracted, and Grart! How could I forget? maybe it's because he's a programmer. Maybe. But anyways, yeah, they are also available for questions. So yeah, feel free to follow along, and I will get into it. So the file that I've prepared for this is a simple little slime here. And what I've found is, as far as, yes, sir?
Could we get access to this file?
You could! That's a brilliant idea. Yeah, I'll send it in the Discord real quick. For those of you who have Sprite. Where actually is that file, though?
Does LibreSprite also import this?
I believe so. I think LibreSprite's compatible with Sprite files.
Okay.
Because it's just a fork of Sprite, so it's going to use all the same.
Yeah.
They're not making their own.
I don't know if there would be any modifications so that I can mess with
I think it's, yeah, all you're going to be missing is just newer updates.
Okay,
for
is that
Sprite.
one or two?
It's a fork, so it's
Okay, I'll go ahead and throw that file, if you'd like to follow along, into, I'll throw it in general. Or, yeah, meeting resources. Okay. There she is. So if you'd like to follow along directly, feel free to use that file. But yeah, so, first thing to say about this particular file is the background. I'm going to be making the slime drunk, which means I want to keep track of its starting position. So I've got in the background here, just this little section down here of the dark gray. That is our floor in this void that this guy's stuck in. Then we're going to set up our animation. I usually like to just kind of get all of the frames that I want to use in there right away and delete the ones that we're not using yet. That way I can get a sense of how long the animation is. I like to stick with 8 frames when it comes to hand-drawn pixel art stuff because I feel like that is a good length for animation that looks well. We'll call this slime idle, or I guess it's not an idle, it's a slime jump. Okay, so when it comes to actually animating the motion of a sprite, what I like to do is I will make a new layer, call it silhouette, if I can spell that word correctly. Then I will choose an arbitrary color. I'll go with like a bright yellow or something like that. And just completely draw over the silhouette of the thing that I'm animating. So what this does is choosing an arbitrary color lets me not even begin to worry about rendering it yet. And then also, I can just paste it over into the next frame. And let's say I want to start with just getting a sense of what the movement looks like. So very quick and easy, I can say I want it to move 5 pixels up. Then I want it to move 3 pixels up. Then I want it to move 1 pixel, 2 pixels up, 1 pixel up, kind of applying that slow in, slow out sort of a principle. Then I just drag these, get it back to where it started. And at this point, we've got a pretty decent kind of an arc for our jump. Now that we've got our basic motion set up, we can add some of those principles of animation to help us feel a little better about the animations. So for one thing, I might add an additional frame at the beginning here, and then do something like this. Yeah, what's up?
What keybind are you doing to add frames?
Alt N. Yeah, keybinds are just, independent of software. So I wasn't going to cover those too much, unless if like everyone's using Sprite and wants to know. But yeah, in Sprite it's Alt N. So we can start with an anticipation frame. So let's say we want it to just be sitting still for a couple of frames here before it starts moving. Then for the actual motion itself, we can kind of do something like this, where we maybe scale it down a little bit, and then, so this is not only anticipation, but also that kind of squash and stretch. You saw I moved the actual top. I guess I can get rid of those rendered sprites too. Those don't need to be there. But yeah, as I was moving the top down on that sprite, I was also moving it out to compensate. So let's say we want to do that kind of over the course of a couple frames. So this is where tweening comes into play. I'll get rid of one of those to just keep the other one. In Sprite, to turn on onion skins is this little button right here. So I'll turn that on. I'll hide the background because I have it displaying behind that. And I will also hide that. So now we can see, like right here, for instance, this little line, that is our next frame. That's where we're going to be. This line up here, that's where we started from. And where the color is a little bit darker, that's where we have an intersection. So we can go ahead and start planning around that. Make a tween frame that is just a little bit in between both of those states. So maybe it looks something like this. And then we fill that in. And then we've got our tween. So that's our motion now. And maybe we can prepare it to start going into that kind of going in on itself sort of a frame that we've got going on by taking away some of that top part. Maybe a little bit more than that. So yeah, now we've got something of an anticipation. I'll have it loop a little bit better than that. But yeah, there's our anticipation. So now we can go into the actual motion itself and think to ourselves, okay, the shape of this slime, for instance, if I go back to the rendered sprite, looks a little bottom heavy, just because of the little gumdrop shape. A lot of the mass is just kind of pooling down into the bottom. So maybe when it's flying up, it is doing so in kind of a delayed way. And this is also an example of our secondary motion at work. So we can take our slime and apply some squash and stretch to him. Have him take on this kind of a bell shape for a little bit and show that he is lagging some of the mass that he's trying to jump up with behind. So, let's see. And then we just continue that sort of a thing until we get to our apex of the jump. So, okay. there. We have him go in a little bit more, maybe. Start to have that top part continue to get a little bit ahead of itself. Let's see, this can also be a good time to, let's see, there we go. So, this also lets us know that if we think of this frame as our keyframe, and this frame as our next keyframe, viewing this as a tween, we can see kind of how we're doing there. So, as far as being an in-between is concerned, something we could do if we want to convey that the motion happening here is rapid is exaggerate the proportions of the slime a little bit, ignoring the conservation of mass, but using the exaggeration of the motion to convey speed. You can also see this if, for instance, if you're swinging a sword or something like that through blur frames, which is what is happening. Let's see, is it this one? Yeah. Here, where you've got these very exaggerated massive swipes that respond to the swipe, that would be a blur frame. So, now that we're starting to get to the apex of our jump here, where the movement has slowed a lot, we can have we can treat this as another keyframe. And we can have the mass of the slime kind of start catching up to it a little bit. So it's at the apex of its jump, but its weight is still catching up to it. So we have it, let's see, I am doing that. Maybe it's still a bit stretched, but it's starting to have some of that weight return to the top a little bit. Maybe something like that. Yeah. Okay. So now here we are at the jump's apex, and we can kind of prepare it to start going back down. So now that we're done stretching it, maybe we can start swashing it a little bit again. So we just expand it a little bit, and then squash it to compensate. Just by a little bit though, because we want to still convey that it's at its apex, so it's back kind of at its base form, because its weight has mostly evened itself out, and the motion is the slowest that it will be. So here's what we've got so far. Just kind of applying those principles in a way that makes sense to the mass of the object. I'll turn off onion skins because otherwise it'll look weird. But yeah, so you can see, even though we're not quite done yet, that is in a state that is much more appealing than it would be if we were just kind of moving our frames up and down. So, since we like that, why are those sprites back? I don't want those there. So yeah, now that we're happy with that, we can go ahead and start applying some more dynamic motion to the falling frames. And to do that, we really just need to apply the exact opposite effects of what we had going on with the frames that we're applying to get ourselves up there. So, we can say that, okay, since we've established that this slime is kind of bottom heavy, maybe the bottom the weight wants to stay up in the air a little bit longer than the top does. So we squash it a little bit. We compensate for that. I'm not going to do that actually. I'm just going to do it like this. Add just a little bit of mass like that. Then we want to have the very top of the slime start falling a little bit more fast than the bottom. So we can do the same sort of thing that we did with the anticipation, where it's kind of collapsing in on itself. Maybe a little bit more gradually than that. If I wanted to do maybe something like that, and it's falling, so it's getting left behind. There are little pieces of it are getting left behind a little bit, so maybe it's kind of something like that. That might be a little bit too extreme. That's too much. I can kind of get that already. So we'll keep it here and see how we like that. Although it's a little bit too. Yeah. Okay. No. Anyways. No, I'm still not. I feel like that's too much. Yeah, a lot of animation is just tweaking it as you go. But we can kind of establish that that's how the movement's going to look and start to resolve it so that, to make sure that we loop back and are back at our base frame. So we want to say that, okay, if this is the fastest it's falling, then this frame right here is going to be the most extreme. So maybe we want to really stretch it in this frame. Really have it be maybe something like that. Coming back in. And it's still leaving just little bits of itself that aren't falling quite as fast as where most of the mass is going. So this is another tween. Which means that we want to average the motion between the two. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete that and draw it from scratch. I'll do so by maybe just saying this is where we want it to be. Oh, that's a good idea for the other frame, actually. Maybe we want this part to be, yeah, not quite as weighty as the previous frame. Up a little bit. Maybe start having it do kind of like a, something like that, we'll say. And one thing that I found is pretty vital for not getting burnt out while animating is not to obsess over things right away. Because I already know, and maybe you're kind of feeling this while watching too, that this probably won't look great first pass, but that's okay, because we can just go back and fix it. So we'll say this is where our guy's at right now. Maybe distribute that a little bit. Have it do that on this frame too. Have it come down. We're really falling, and we're back to the start. So let's watch that, see if we like it or not. With the understanding that given the amount of motion we've put into this one, which is pretty extreme, there will be a pretty substantial reaction that just doesn't exist yet. So we're going to have to add that. But here's what we've got so far. And I'll hide that so it stops blinking. So having watched that, I think that I agree with what I was saying earlier, where this is a bit too extreme. It's really subjective at this point, but kind of tweaking it a little bit and seeing what minor changes happen is just kind of the name of the game at this point. So maybe I want to do something like that instead and have kind of this, maybe something like, nah. So that's a little bit less extreme, so I can go back and watch that. I like that less. So That might be a bit too similar to the previous frame, but that's okay. So we put it back. And yeah, I think that's not bad. So we can add a couple of more frames, maybe two, and start working on an anticipation. So between, let's just add one. Let's make it one frame of anticipation. That's our keyframe for the time being. So we turn our onion skins on. We're at a point where we want our guy to have landed. And upon landing, there's going to be a lot of impact. We're going to see a pretty good amount of squashing. So maybe he's just completely splatted on the ground at this point and is kind of like, you know, he's pretty liquid or fluid, presumably. So we're going to start just having him, maybe, let's say the top of the sprite is here. So we kind of have this going on where he's very much looped a little bit and move that down by one to kind of maintain the motion that was in the previous frame. And then we're going to add one more tween to start resolving that motion and kind of even it out a little bit. So maybe we want something like this where it's almost back to square one. All right. I'll do that. Yeah, I'll keep it the way it is. Actually, no, I'll actually get rid of more of those. Okay. So we're at a point where we have anticipation, motion, squash and stretch, and what's it called? Just reaction, I guess. Follow through. That's the word I was looking for. So now we've got our motion. And I think that looks not bad. So now that I'm happy with the total amount of motion that is happening here, we can start rendering it. So this is our only rendered sprite at the moment. And we will just do it kind of piece by piece. So the first thing to do is to start caring about color a little bit. We can get rid of that silhouette since it's already rendered. But we're going to go ahead and, oh yeah, these are the same frames. So I guess we can copy those over there. So we'll just put in our base color on all of these frames. And that is our first step of rendering. So now we can kind of just see, all right, that's the color we're working with this. Then we can add our eyes. And this will be our first example of secondary motion. So we need to start keeping track of where the eyes are in relation to the body, the rest of the body. So they kind of squash in accordance to the rest of the motion here. Then maybe at this point, to really show how much squash is happening here, maybe they get a little bit wider. Then, as they spring up, they do kind of the inverse of what was happening in the previous frame. They stretch a little bit alongside everything else. And then they keep doing that on this frame. So let's see, maybe I want to move them in by a pixel, have them do like that. Now we're at a point where we start resolving the motion a little bit. So they're no longer blurred. They're still kind of inwards to respond to the stretching that was happening in the previous frames. But they're going to start going back outwards again. So we go from here to here, maybe. That might be a bit too extreme. We'll find out. And then we can start having the eyes correspond to the falling motion. So maybe they, like the rest of the slime, have a bit of a delay going on, and they are just kind of at random points in the body. And we're at our most extreme here. So they're just like fully up there at the top of the slime. Maybe they start blurring again in these last 2 frames because we're falling. And then we even it all out with the squash. Have it, let's see, we're here, so maybe we have them kind of start coming in a little bit like that. And let's see how that looks. One thing to note, I didn't do that on a separate layer. You should. That's good practice. I'm just lazy like that, I guess. Okay, so first pass, we notice this part of the animation, that's way too extreme. That looks like it's being moved by a completely separate force from the jump. So we're going to need to go back and edit that a little bit. But that's okay. So what I'll start doing to resolve that is instead of having this correspond to the stretch a little bit more, because it's starting to even itself out at this point in the animation, we have it actually follow into that. And that may have just been the thing that we needed to do to fix it, so we'll watch it again from the ground up. Okay. It definitely still, let's see, this frame, this is the issue frame. And the way that I identified that is, if you watch it, bam, there's this kind of back and forth motion here, where essentially here, if I go into a new layer and mark it, we start our position here with our eyes, then keep that relative. Here's our position on the next frame, and then we just copy those both over. And here's our position on this frame. So the issue here is if we look at our arc here, which I've outlined just through these little shapes here, our arc at this point in the animation looks like this, where we start here and we end up at the same spot. We don't really want that because it makes it look like really unnatural motion is happening. So we're going to figure out how to fix that. First step would be, I suppose, to just move them back to where they were on the previous frames and see how it looks with just like that static motion. Okay. That looks a bit better, I think. Could maybe have these start to move out a little bit though. Okay. So, all right. The other problem I'm noticing while I'm working on this is that it seems to me, at least, as I'm kind of parsing through this, that the motion when the eyes are falling is... Okay, well, for one thing, I'm noticing this now. If you look at these frames, it's another example of what I was just talking about. This arc is one that we don't really want in this point in the animation, where it goes in and then immediately back out. The way I think about it, at least, when it comes to these sorts of circumstances, is why are we moving in here? This is a sort of anticipation to this next frame. So if the follow-through on that frame is for them to go back out, then the motion going in here doesn't make sense. It's not anticipating anything. So probably what we want to do instead is have them start going out. And potentially go back to this frame. We'll find out if this looks weird. Kind of looks like a frog, but that's okay. And then let's say we want to move these out a little bit more. Something like that. Where, or maybe he's just fully, yeah. He's a little A little EP. Okay. So, watch that a couple more times. There's still something I don't like about these two frames. So, I'm thinking, at least, that this needs to go more gradually. So, again, talking about anticipation in animation, why have they started to move out on that frame if the rest of the body hasn't? They have nothing to react to at this point. So, even though it's kind of starting to resolve the motion, we're still not quite ready for the secondary action to happen yet because it's not responding to anything. So, at the point in the animation where the squash starts to happen again, maybe we can start to do that. And then, yeah, so we're anticipating another squash there. Let's see. And yeah, I don't think that looks too bad. I think this frame is still a little unnatural looking. And also just kind of goofy in general. But in general, especially if you're working on a game jam, honestly, you should stop well before this point in tweaking an animation. This is at a pretty solid spot. So we can get on to our next step in rendering. And maybe this time I'll use layers. So I will go ahead and say my next step is to outline, because that one's easy. You just gotta, let's see, go in here. I'm not gonna do another layer again, because, yeah. In A-Sprite, Shift-O is the outline hotkey. You just select the area you want to outline, do it, and I'll just kind of keep going, do that for every frame. Actually, another fun A-Sprite fact, if you highlight multiple cells, should have done it for all of them, yeah. So, do that. And now we've got our outline going. If you look at this sprite, it's actually a colored out, or an outline that reacts to the lighting. So the bottom should be a bit darker. We'll go ahead and just make that easy by doing that. 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 And then the last thing is just the highlight on the outline that we will also preserve. So, go ahead and add that. Making sure that it maintains itself. We'll add that here. Have it be a bit more exaggerated to follow the stretch that's happening here. Same thing with this frame. Start to even itself out a little bit. Frames. Oops. launch that back. Cool. So that's the outline done. So now we'll go ahead and take our next step for rendering. We'll do the cheeks, because those will be easy. Or they should be easy at least. So kind of just going to go in and do it frame by frame again. A little bit tedious, but that's the rendering process. The most fun part is the motion. Whatever. Okay, make sure that tracks, which it does for the most part. And then we'll do the shading, which, yeah. So just while I'm kind of doing this, since it's a little bit tedious and not a lot's happening, can I get a show of hands who all is actually following along or just making a line of their own right now? I saw your hand go up and then get put back down. What's going on? I see you don't have a laptop out in front of you also. Anyways. Yeah, again, file is in the, whatever chat I put into, the resource, yeah, that one. And for those of you following along, if you have any questions or if you're kind of finding that your motion that you're getting you aren't quite happy with for whatever reason or anything like that, again, feel free to pipe up. This part, definitely not the most engaging thing in the world. It's a lot of just step-by-step rendering, but it's important to making sure that your final animation is cohesive, because if you don't treat it as kind of a step-by-step process, then you might forget something or just forget to keep track of a specific detail. So I find that just taking it step by step, comparing my current progress to the initial rendered sprite that I started out with and find what is like missing, and then proceeding from there is just the easiest way to get a decent rendered sprite, or fully rendered animation rather. But yeah, this is the part of the process that is not quite as interesting as getting the motion going. It's a lot of repetition. Let's see, is that what I want? Yeah, I guess so. And here. Maybe that. Maybe I'll do that on this frame too. Give it a little bit of that rim lighting that's going on there. Same with this one. Here's what I'll do. I'll have that come out a little bit like this instead to get a better sense of that shape. That might look a little weird though. Alright, and then here. And now we're back to square one. So now that that part of the process is over, we can go ahead and watch it again and see how we feel about the added step of rendering, which I think it turned out pretty well, so I'm not going to tweak anything for the time being. Now we're going to move on to the next step, which is this highlight that I've got going on. I'm going to just add that to all of the frames individually again. Which, as tedious as this part of the process is, it's usually the part where you kind of know that you're done with like having to think about things, so there is a certain amount of respite in that, I guess. Go ahead and trim that back a little bit, I guess. Trim that back a little bit. Don't want it to get too much. Then have the same thing be held true here. In this particular frame, I'll go ahead and opt to leave the highlight out of this for the time being, since it's started to move in a way that places it under the rest of the body. Like this is the part where the shaded outline starts to get darker. So we'll see how that looks, but yeah, making sure that you're thinking about stuff like that is valuable. And we're almost done with this part. Oh, what happened there? Right. Okay, so that is the highlight done. Looking not bad. So, last, I think, oh, well, those need to be different. But yeah, last part of the process is to add these brighter highlights. So, this is a part where onion skins may be useful, which lets me show off another thing in Sprite, and also just general animation. So usually, there will be an options menu like this about your timeline. One thing about it that's kind of handy is you can move where your timeline is listed. So typically, if I am animating, I'll keep my timeline at the bottom. But if I'm not, I'll keep it off to the side. That way I can just like see way more layers at once. But beyond that, the other thing to show off is if I want to use onion skins to manage the position of this little highlight here, I'll turn them on and you'll see it's rendering behind the sprite. We don't want that, so we can just check in front of instead. And now it's a little bit messy. I typically am not a fan of using onion skins like this, but it does at least let us see, all right, this is where the highlight last was. So wait, that frame. That's why I don't like using it, because you can't tell what's happening. But it does at least let us see, all right, here's where our last highlight was roughly. So on this frame, maybe we want it more like here. Yeah, then it's gonna start squishing, so it's gonna get up there. Then we jump. So let's see, comparing that to the first one. I'm gonna place it right there. And I'll make sure to keep the shape fairly well preserved. So for this one, I'll probably just copy that same shape and move it accordingly. Then we've got you, do that. Same thing here. Stretch it a little bit. Same thing. Oops. Same thing. This one will be interesting. So I'll put it in like that. Okay, so we've got that first highlight in. Let's see if it maintains its shape pretty well. Yeah, it's not bad. I would probably tweak this a little bit, but I'm not gonna because I want to move on. So I will go ahead and add some of the surrounding little green bits that were in there. Okay. Now, we're almost done. Just gotta get this last little bit in there. So, preserve that. Go. There we go. Okay, so that, I believe, is every step of the rendering process that I took for the idle sprite. So let's see it. Nice. So that is our fully rendered sprite, basically. That is a jump animation. And we'll pretend that there are no other animations that we need for this particular game object because I'm not doing all that. So, in order to actually integrate this sprite that we just made into the little project that I still have opened up over here, we're going to go into File, Export, Export Sprite Sheet. That'll take you to this screen. Which kind of gives us the side-by-side view of each frame. Here's our sprite sheet. Go ahead and dough. We're gonna grab wherever I put it, you, and we're gonna add to, not that, to node 2D. We're gonna add a sprite. So, to get this set up, and in most cases, you're probably going to want to make a new scene out of this, but for the sake of demonstration, I'm just going to go ahead and drag our texture into there. That gives us our sprite sheet. Now, you'll see because we changed the filter settings, that is all good to go. It looks crisp. We're going to go ahead and go into animation here, and we see H frames and V frames. Going back to the slideshow real quick. Where's the sprite sheets one? I think it's above. Yeah, okay. So using this sprite sheet here as an example, for instance, our H frames are just our horizontal frames, and V frames are, of course, vertical ones. This sprite sheet is only one animation, and even if it wasn't, I would probably just make it horizontal. So we only need to worry about this value. Going back into A sprite, we can quickly see this is a 14 frame animation. So we set H frames to 14. And now we've got, we can, oops, no. Okay. Yeah, okay. We can iterate through it frame by frame, see that it all looks good, and go ahead and add an animation player to our 2D sprite. Create a new animation. We'll call this slime jump. And then in here, we can go ahead and start keying frames. So, let's see. Change that to FPS. And this is 14 frames. And the actual FPS, if we go into A sprite, we can look at our frame properties and see 100 millisecond duration. That doesn't translate super evenly into FPS, but I just, off the top of my head, I know that that is 12 FPS, roughly. So we set that to 12. The frame duration, why did that change? It's 14. Then we just go ahead, go into our sprite. We make sure that we're at the start of the animation there. And we're going to start keying our frames. So we're going to change this value back to 0. Let it update. Actually, that's our last frame technically. So we'll start it on, I don't care. Start it on 0. We are not going to bother with Bezier curves. And we're just going to start keying frames. Zoom into this a little bit to see it better. But once we do one, we just uptick it. And after we key 2 frames, it knows where we want to put the next one and what we want to be iterating through up here. So we just key them till it's done. Is that the same frame? Okay. Then we can go ahead and go in here, play, and it doesn't loop. How do I do that? Next to the, oh, thank you. Yeah. And now we've got it set up in Eddington. One thing you might notice is this animation in its current state is kind of breaking one of the rules I had mentioned earlier, which is no, that's way too far out. Yeah, here. We don't want our animations to do any changes in position for a sprite. I think in this case, if you were to be using this as just like a general walking animation, it's fine. But if this was our jump, like say this slime's our player character, and this is our jump input, so it needs to correspond to some physics, that we've implemented. We don't want this. So to fix that, we're gonna probably want to go back into Sprite, and we will make a no. Nice suggestion though. We're gonna make a new layer. Call this, I don't know, just something.
Ooh, bad name.
You name it. What's it called?
I don't know. No, wait, no, don't actually. Don't actually name it that. I don't know. Slime guy.
Slime guy?
Yeah, slime
Okay.
guy. Much
Well,
better.
that's not what's going on this layer, but that's okay. What actually is going on this layer, which is named extremely appropriately and wonderfully, is a baseline.
Oh, so you can call it baseline?
No. Why would I do that? So we're just gonna copy that across all of our frames, and that lets us normalize the position of our slime. So instead of having him move here, we just want to drag him down to the baseline. Get down there.
It might have been a little.
No, I think I got it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
Oh, he's so wiggly.
So now it looks a little weird because he's not moving at all. But this, if the slime were to be moved in game, makes a lot more sense than having the actual sprite sheet move. And then we can go ahead and just, hide that. We would then re-export it. And I'm not going to do all that because we've already gone through this process, but that is most likely what our end result would be. But yeah, that is a fully rendered and implemented sprite into whatever project this would be. And that is the process, and you do that for everything you animate, and it takes a long time. So, but yeah, I'll go ahead and start walking around now, and some of the other officers probably should start doing the same. And if you have questions, or if you're still working on an animation of your own, I can come by and just take a look at it. And yeah, we got like 15 minutes left in the meeting.